Mr.ShroomCaster. Hi, my name's Alex, and I've always been that guy who's obsessed with nature. You know, the outdoorsy type. Tents, backpacks, campfires. It's not just a hobby for me. It's part of who I am. Since I was a kid, I've been drawn to the woods. My grandfather worked as a forest ranger, and I'd often go with him on walks. He taught me how to track animals, read a map, and even tie knots. Over time, hiking became my go-to escape from the chaos of life, a way to clear my head and recharge. I live in a small town, the kind with quiet streets, a few coffee shops, and a park with ducks. But I work in the city, a big company, standard office job, spreadsheets, deadlines, endless meetings. By the end of the day, my head feels like it's going to explode, and the city noise doesn't help. That's why I cherish my weekends. Usually, I go hiking with friends, Ben, Mike, or Emmy. We've got our traditions. If someone forgets matches, they automatically do the dishes after the trip. But this time, I wanted something different. I'd been toying with the idea of a solo hike for a while. Just me, nature, and complete freedom. No chatter, no campfire jokes. Just the sound of my boots on the trail and the rustling of leaves. It felt like the perfect way to unwind. My plan? A route through one of the most remote national parks in our state. No cell service, no crowds, just wilderness. I picked a trail that was about 12 miles to a campsite and back. Nothing too crazy. If things got rough, I could always turn around. I spent a whole evening prepping. My backpack was packed to perfection. Enough food for 3 days, extra batteries for my flashlight, a gas stove, and even a backup map. By the time I was done, it looked like I was ready to survive a zombie apocalypse. It was mid-autumn, and the scenery was breathtaking. Golden leaves, crisp air, perfect hiking weather. I could already picture myself sitting by a campfire, watching the stars. Friends were a little surprised by my solo plan. "You sure about this?" Ben asked. "Won't it be boring?" "Nah, at least no one's snoring in the next tent," I joked. Emmy laughed. "Just make sure you're back by Monday. Who else is going to finish that report?" As I closed my car door and stepped onto the trail, I felt a rush of excitement. The forest seemed alive, breathing with the rhythm of rustling leaves and chirping birds. For a moment, I thought, why didn't I do this sooner? But looking back now, I realize there's a reason experienced hikers say never to go solo. I started early in the morning, just as the sun was rising. The air was crisp, with a light fog hanging between the trees, and the trail ahead looked like it had been pulled straight out of a postcard. Each step felt effortless. The forest seemed alive with the sound of birds chirping and leaves crunching underfoot. It was peaceful, serene, everything I'd been hoping for. After about an hour, I stopped to rest on a fallen log. I pulled out my water bottle and took a moment to study the map. The trail was straightforward, 12 miles to the campsite and back. Easy. As I sat there, the morning fog began to lift, revealing more of the forest around me. That's when I saw it. An empty plastic bottle lying in the middle of the trail. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably left behind by some careless hiker, I thought. But something about it felt off. It was too clean, too new, like it had just been dropped. I shrugged it off and kept walking, but then I spotted something else. A candy wrapper, crumpled and left beside the path. The way it was lying there, almost intentionally placed, sent a small shiver down my spine. Weird, I muttered to myself, but tried to push the thought aside. The forest began to change as I moved deeper. The trees grew closer together, and the trail narrowed. The cheerful sounds of the morning started to fade, replaced by an uneasy silence. My steps felt louder, echoing unnaturally in the stillness. A few miles later, I heard the first sound that truly unsettled me. A whistle. It was faint, almost carried by the wind, but distinct enough to catch my attention. I stopped in my tracks and scanned the forest. Nothing. Probably just a bird, I thought, though my gut told me otherwise. A few minutes later, it happened again, this time louder. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. I stood there, frozen, straining my ears for any other sound, but the forest had gone silent again. I pressed on, trying to shake the growing unease. Eventually, I reached a small clearing and decided to take a break. It was a picturesque spot, with sunlight streaming through the canopy and a gentle brook running nearby. I sat down, pulled out a sandwich, and tried to focus on the peaceful setting. But then I noticed something else. Across the clearing, near a cluster of trees, the ground looked disturbed. The leaves were scuffed and pushed aside, as if someone, or something, had walked through recently. My eyes traced what looked like a faint footprint, though it was hard to tell in the uneven soil. A chill ran down my spine. I packed up quickly and got back on the trail. The further I went, the narrower and more overgrown it became. Branches brushed against my arms, and I had to duck under low-hanging limbs. The forest felt different now, less welcoming, more watchful. As the sun began to set, the unease I'd been feeling all day grew stronger. I still hadn't seen another person, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I found the backpack. It was lying just off the trail, propped awkwardly against a tree. At first, I thought someone had stopped to rest and forgotten it, but as I got closer, I realized it was empty. No scattered gear, no signs of its owner, just the pack itself, abandoned. I didn't touch it. Something about the way it was sitting felt deliberate, almost staged. My instincts screamed at me to keep moving, and I didn't argue. By the time I reached my campsite, the sky was turning a deep orange. I hurried to set up my tent, working faster than usual. As the last light of day faded, I built a small fire, hoping it would keep the unease, and whatever might be out there, at bay. But even as the flames crackled and the warmth spread, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, the forest transformed. During the day, it had felt peaceful, alive. Now, it was something else entirely. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, and the usual sounds of nature, crickets, distant rustling, were replaced by an eerie stillness. Even the fire, which flickered and crackled in front of me, didn't feel like enough protection. I sat close to the flames, eating my dinner, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't stop thinking about the backpack, the footprints, and, most of all, the whistle. It played over and over in my head, clear and sharp, as if it were still echoing through the trees. To distract myself, I decided to jot down some notes in my journal. I always kept one during hikes, a habit I'd picked up years ago. Normally, I'd write about the trail, the weather, maybe a particularly stunning view. Tonight, my notes were different, short, scattered observations, found an empty backpack. Strange sounds. Whistling. I stopped writing when I heard the first sound. It was faint, a soft rustling, like leaves being disturbed. My eyes darted to the edge of the firelight. The trees stood silent and still, their shadows stretching toward me like skeletal hands. Probably just a raccoon, I muttered to myself, though my voice sounded shaky. I reached for my flashlight and aimed it at the darkness beyond the fire. The beam cut through the night, illuminating trunks and branches, but there was nothing there. For a moment, I felt relief. But then it happened again. This time, it was louder, a distinct crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I stood up, gripping the flashlight tightly, and slowly swept the beam around the campsite. The shadows seemed to dance and flicker, but I saw nothing out of place. Just trees, bushes, and the faint outline of my tent. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. A deer, maybe, or the wind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I added more wood to the fire, watching as the flames grew taller and brighter. The light made me feel safer, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was just beyond its reach. Hours passed, but I couldn't sleep. I sat by the fire, clutching my flashlight and listening intently. Every now and then, I'd hear a sound, a faint rustle, a soft crack, but when I looked, there was nothing there. Around midnight, I finally decided to try lying down. I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and turned off the flashlight. The darkness inside was almost comforting, a barrier between me and whatever was out there. But as soon as I closed my eyes, the sounds returned. At first, it was subtle, just the occasional crunch of leaves or snap of a twig. Then it grew louder, closer. My heart pounded as I held my breath, straining to hear. And then it happened. Something brushed against the side of my tent. It was soft, almost hesitant, like someone, or something, testing it. My entire body froze. I wanted to call out, but fear gripped my throat. Instead, I reached for the knife I always kept by my sleeping bag and gripped it tightly. The brushing stopped, replaced by silence. For a few agonizing minutes, I lay there, waiting. Then, suddenly, there was a sharp tug on the fabric of the tent. I couldn't take it anymore. In one swift motion, I unzipped the tent, flashlight in one hand and knife in the other. The beam of light pierced the darkness, swinging wildly as I searched for the source of the sound. Nothing. The campsite was empty. The fire had died down, but it still glowed faintly, casting dim light across the clearing. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I turned in circles, scanning the trees. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, refusing to go back into the tent. I kept the flames alive, feeding them with whatever wood I could find. Every so often, I'd hear a noise, a rustle, a faint snap, but I didn't investigate. I didn't want to know. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt an overwhelming wave of relief. The pale sunlight seemed to push back the shadows, revealing the familiar shapes of the forest. But even as I packed up my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I left the campsite without looking back. The first rays of sunlight brought a sense of relief, but it was fleeting. The forest that had seemed so magical yesterday now felt oppressive, as if it wanted me gone. I packed up my gear quickly, skipping breakfast, and extinguished the remnants of the fire. Every sound around me felt amplified. The rustle of leaves, the creak of branches, even my own footsteps as I hurried to leave the campsite. Back on the trail, I tried to shake off the lingering fear from the night before. The rational part of me insisted it was just my imagination, a mix of exhaustion and an overactive mind. But deep down, I couldn't convince myself. As I moved further along the path, I noticed something strange. The trail looked different. The trees were closer together, the undergrowth denser. It was as if the forest itself had shifted overnight. Then I saw the first marker. A small stack of rocks, carefully balanced, stood right in the middle of the trail. It wasn't there yesterday, of that I was certain. I stopped and stared at it for a moment, my stomach tightening. Who had put it there? I glanced around, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. The forest was still and silent, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. Trying to shake off the unease, I stepped around the rocks and continued on. But a few minutes later, I saw another stack, and then another. Each one was identical to the first, placed at regular intervals along the trail. My pace quickened. I didn't stop to inspect them. The logical part of my brain tried to come up with explanations. Trail markers, maybe? But they felt deliberate, almost like warnings. After about an hour, I heard the first sound that made my blood run cold. It was a whistle. The same one I'd heard the day before, clear and sharp, echoing through the trees. I froze in place, every muscle in my body tensing. It sounded closer this time. Too close. Hello? I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The whistle didn't come again. But the silence that followed was even worse. It was the kind of silence that presses on your ears, that makes you hyper-aware of every breath and heartbeat. I forced myself to keep moving, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was following me, staying just out of sight. Then I found the rope. It was lying off to the side of the trail, partially hidden in the grass. Old, frayed, and knotted in several places, it looked like it had been there for years. But something about it felt wrong. It was too close to the path, too deliberately placed. I didn't touch it. I didn't even pause for long. My instincts screamed at me to keep moving, and I listened. The trail grew narrower as I pressed on, the trees forming a thick canopy overhead that blocked out most of the sunlight. Every now and then, I'd hear a sound, a rustle, a snap, but when I looked, there was nothing there. Then I saw the figure. It was standing on the trail ahead, far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but close enough to know it wasn't an illusion. A tall, motionless figure, partially obscured by the trees. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hey!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who's there?" The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent and still. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I stepped off the trail and into the dense undergrowth, pushing through bushes and low-hanging branches. My only goal was to put as much distance between myself and that figure as possible. The forest was thicker here, the ground uneven and littered with roots and rocks. My rucksack snagged on branches, and my arms were scratched by thorns, but I kept going. Then I heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, coming from somewhere behind me. They weren't hurried, but they weren't trying to be quiet, either. I broke into a run, my breathing ragged and my legs screaming in protest. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I didn't dare look back. After what felt like hours, I stumbled out of the trees and onto the road. The sight of the asphalt made my knees buckle with relief. For a moment, I just stood there, bent over and gasping for air. But the fear hadn't left me. I could still feel it, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I looked back toward the forest, half expecting to see someone, or something, emerge from the trees. But the edge of the woods was empty. I didn't wait. I started walking down the road, putting as much distance as I could between myself and the trailhead. Standing in the middle of the road, I struggled to catch my breath. My heart was pounding so hard. It felt like even the forest could hear it. Behind me stretched the same dense, dark woods I had just escaped. Ahead, an empty asphalt road disappeared into the distance, illuminated by the soft morning sun. For a moment, I just stood there. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with a lingering sense of unease. I didn't know how much farther I had to go to reach my car. All that mattered was that I was on the road now, and that gave me a sliver of hope. After a few minutes, I forced myself to move. My legs were trembling from exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. The faint hope that a car might come by and pick me up felt like wishful thinking. This place was far too remote for that. Maybe half an hour passed before I heard it. A sound behind me. It was quiet, but distinct enough to make me freeze. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the rustling of leaves. It was a footstep. I whipped around. The forest stood still and silent, almost like it was mocking me. I squinted, trying to catch any hint of movement among the trees. Nothing. It felt like I might break into a sprint at any second, but my rational mind told me it was just nerves, just exhaustion playing tricks on me. I turned back and started walking again, this time glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The road sloped downward, curving around a hill. On one side was the forest, and on the other, a gentle slope covered in grass and bushes. I tried to focus on the road, but every sound from the woods sent shivers down my spine. And then I heard it again. The whistle. The same one I'd heard in the forest. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was close, too close, somewhere right at the edge of the road in the trees. I couldn't take it anymore. My legs seemed to move on their own, carrying me forward as fast as I could manage. I ran, my backpack bouncing against my shoulders, my lungs burning with every step. All I could think was, get to the car. Get to the car. I ran until my legs felt like they might give out. Finally, I saw it, the familiar curve in the road. I remembered that just beyond it was the parking lot where I had left my car. The last few yards felt like miles. I practically stumbled over the cracks and potholes in the road, desperate to keep moving. And then, there it was, my car, sitting alone in the empty parking lot, surrounded by overgrown bushes. I didn't look back. I sprinted to the car, fumbling with the keys as I yanked them out of my pocket. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a few tries to unlock the door. When I finally climbed inside, I slammed the door shut and immediately locked it. My hands were trembling as I shoved the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life, and I almost sighed in relief. But then, as I glanced into the rearview mirror, I saw something move. At the edge of the woods, just where the trees began to thin, something, or someone, shifted among the shadows. My foot instinctively slammed down on the gas pedal. The tires screeched against the asphalt, and the car shot forward. Only once I was speeding down the road did I realize how tightly I was gripping the steering wheel. The road stretched out ahead of me, winding through the hills. I kept my eyes fixed on it, but every shadow at the edge of my vision made my heart race. When I finally reached the city, I pulled into my driveway and parked the car. But I didn't get out right away. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, letting the silence of the neighborhood wash over me. For the first time in hours, I felt a fragile sense of safety. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside the window sent my pulse racing. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. The empty backpack, the strange rock formations, the figure on the trail, the whistle. It all felt like a bad dream. But the scratches on my arms and the ache in my legs reminded me it was real. Since that day, I haven't gone on another solo hike. The forest, once a place of peace and freedom for me, now feels like something entirely different. Sometimes, when I'm walking in a quiet park or sitting near a wooded trail, I catch myself listening. And every so often, I think I hear it again, a faint whistle carried on the wind. In those moments, I know one thing for sure. I'll never hike alone again.